Jesus walks on the water. It's a familiar Bible story, right? We were taught this in Sunday school, or we show our children or grandchildren this story and pictures in their children's Bibles. And most depictions of this scene look like this. They show a smiling Jesus helping a distraught Peter, often in the daytime. And in fact, I found these images under the label, "The most brilliant and also stunning Jesus walks on the water." And then I even found a picture of this activity where you can put blue Jell-O in a cup, and you can cut out the boat and then Jesus and the Peter, and if you shove Peter down, he sinks. Jesus walking on the water. Well, this story comes right after the feeding of the 5,000, another familiar story that we heard Pastor Brock talk about last week. Right after the disciples clean up and they collect their 12 baskets of leftover pieces, they are told by Jesus to immediately get in their boat and leave and head across the Sea of Galilee. Jesus wants them to head to the other side of the lake, where there will be a crowd waiting for them in Gennesaret that needs healing. And then Jesus will dismiss the crowd on his own and do something that he often takes time to do. He goes up to the mountain to pray. Instead of hurrying from one mission site to the next mission site, Jesus pauses to go and pray and be present with God, to renew himself and to prepare himself so that he is ready to go out into the world in mission. So when Jesus joins the disciples, it's actually in the middle of the night and in the middle of this turbulent storm. And in the ancient Roman Greco world, the night was divided into 4 watches. The first was from 6 p.m. to 9 a.m., and then 9 a.m. to midnight, and then midnight to 3 a.m., and then 3 a.m. to 6 a.m., so they were each 3 hours long. And we hear in the Gospel of Matthew this interaction of Jesus and his disciples takes place in the 4th watch. So this would have been from 3 to 6 a.m. I was curious when it gets light out in that part of the world, so I Googled it, and nautical twilight doesn't occur until between 5:30 and 6. So though our Sunday school images kind of show this depiction as happening during the day, in fact, if there was any light, it was most likely the moon, or stars, or the slightest bit of the sun starting to peek out. And also in the Greco-Roman world, there's a preoccupation with superstition and apparitions. And so in this time and place, in the darkness with the waves pitching the boat to and fro, and just the faintest light beginning to creep over the hills, it would have been quite frightening to see somebody walking towards you on the water, even if that person looked like Jesus. The disciples had been with Jesus before near the water, but Jesus was always inside the boat or on the shore, never walking on the water. And so think of how strange this would have been for the disciples. We hear that after the disciples notice this ghost-like Jesus, Jesus immediately speaks to them. "Take heart. It is I. Do not be afraid." A better translation of "take heart" from the Greek is "have courage." And Peter initially seems to have a great deal of courage. Now, I don't know if anybody here has tried to get out of a boat before, but it can be a little bit awkward, right? Peter would have had to lift his one leg up over the side of the boat first, and then test the water to see if he could stand. And then think about shifting your weight from the boat that's solid, that's holding you, to water which has never held you standing before. And then the moment of letting go of the side of the boat. Now that's courage. A brief story of courage from Guatemala. There was once a 15-year-old girl, and she went to an orphanage with her Catholic high school to play with kids and met a boy who told her his story, and he asked if she would come back. And so she went back, as she promised, and she began to realize, this is a big problem. I'm only 15. There's probably nothing I can do about it. But what would it look like to have a ministry for street boys? Particularly street boys, because she learned a lot of the children at the orphanage had been on the street. They had been on the street, some because they were abused and they left their families. Others because they had been abandoned and still others because their family couldn't care for them, and they needed to send them to the city where there'd be a higher likelihood they would be able to find work. So these boys would go to the city and they would sell newspapers, or roses, or clean the windshields on people's cars, or shine shoes. And at nighttime, they would gather up together, see how much money they could pool, and try to rent a room to sleep in for the night. There could be a dozen or more children sharing the same room. And so this 15-year-old from the story turned 16 and asked the principal of her school, "We have this shed outside. Could I use it to provide some food and water or drink for these street boys?" And so at 16, she would go after school and she would provide food. But more importantly, she would listen to the stories of these children. Sometimes she even snuck them in there at night when they didn't have enough money to rent a room. A couple other teenagers noticed and said they wanted to help, and though all of them realized this was a huge societal problem and they probably couldn't make a big dent, they had to do something. They acted out of their faith with courage to begin this program that a few years later would actually turn into an orphanage. Two of those teenagers became young adults and were married and went to start an orphanage, which was also a huge risk. They had no idea how to prepare paperwork or how to find people to help with the emotional needs of the children, but they acted out of their faith with courage and began this program for street boys. They had to work through bumps in the road and waves of the sea of street children that came, but little by little they did it. God was with them. They began by finding land and building buildings, and they had to get kitchen utensils and beds and clothing, and they did all of this little by little by little. They did it. And Peter did it too. Peter climbed out of the boat and let go of the side and began walking toward Jesus. And then the reality of the storm hit him. Removed from the safety of the boat and removed from his community of friends, Peter was on his own, and the wind was hitting him, and the waves were splashing against him, and who knows if he was literally or figuratively sinking, but he cried out, "Jesus, save me." In this story from Matthew, we see Jesus responds to the disciples immediately, and here he responds to Peter immediately as well, reaching out his hand to catch him as he began to sink. "You have little faith. Why did you doubt? Why did you hesitate? Did the storm scare you? Did the separation from your community scare you? Did being outside of the boat scare you? Why did Peter waver and doubt?" Well, it could have been it was dark and scary and he thought he was seeing a ghost, right? Or maybe the storm, he's standing on water. That's not normal. That could have been scary with water hitting you in the face. So I don't think Jesus was being hard on Peter when he said, "You have little faith, why did you doubt?" We see doubt as a bad thing, right? The disciple Thomas, we have forever labeled as, right, with a negative connotation. However, courage requires doubt. Courage requires trust in the midst of doubt. Courage comes from faith, and faith comes from God. So this young married couple begins the orphanage, and a few years later they arrive one day to find their workers teamed up against them and left and took everything. Even the tiles of a room that hadn't been built yet. Everything, kitchen appliances, everything. They were left with an empty shell and children who had nothing. And this was devastating, but they picked themselves up and they began partnering with other orphanages, and this is when I met them. These directors are Karen and Estuardo of the orphanage Hogar Miguel Magone, where two of my sons have come from. The same orphanage that Tree for Hope partners with in Guatemala to provide long-term hope to children who call both now a girls' and boys' orphanage home. Soon to be expanded, building our first girls' school, Hope Academy. People who come with me to Guatemala meet Karen and Estuardo, and they're often surprised to hear their story and how it was stepping way outside of their comfort zone to begin this orphanage and to do what God was calling them to do. They shifted their weight with one foot originally in this stable and predictable world of the upper middle class where they were from, to this fluid and shaky and chaotic world of street children. And it wasn't easy, and it's still not easy. And they need courage every day to continue. And they find their faith brings them courage. And don't we also need courage every day? Our faith brings us courage to do hard things. To confront a person we've hurt and ask for forgiveness, that's hard. That requires courage. To tell someone we trust we are suffering from addiction or abuse or depression, that's hard. It requires courage. To stand in solidarity with our sisters and brothers experiencing violence and racism, that's really hard and requires a great deal of courage. To suffer great loss and continue to go on requires courage. Jesus spoke, "Have courage," in this story and at two other places in the Gospel of Matthew, both in times of healing. Do you remember the paralytic man in bed? Jesus said to him, "Have courage, son, your sins are forgiven." And then the paralytic man stood up and was healed. And do you remember the woman who was bleeding for many, many years, and she followed Jesus because she just wanted to touch the fringe of his robe? Well, Jesus said to her, "Have courage, daughter. Your faith has made you well." Jesus connects courage and faith and forgiveness. And all of these are entwined together into the identity of Jesus, Son of God, who says, "It is me. Do not be afraid. I am who I am." Jesus, the one who died so that we might live. Jesus, the one who promises to be with us no matter what. Jesus, the one who catches us when we are sinking. May we find courage through our faith to go where God is calling us to go. And when we can't find courage, may our faith community share their courage with us. Have courage. Do not be afraid. The great I Am is with you, ready to catch you and me when we fall again and again and again. And thanks be to God for that.